Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell. And what I'd like to talk about today is how to deal with limiting self-images that interfere with our practice of philosophy. Now, I did introduce this topic about maybe a month or so ago. I called that video Purification. This video is going to build on what I talked about in that video. And the techniques that I'm going to introduce in this video really are intended to be added to the techniques that I introduced a month or so ago. So I really do recommend watching that earlier video first. So I'll link that one above. The techniques that I'm going to talk about today are based on the teachings of my teacher, Dr. Pierre Grimes. He has a background in Plato and also in Zen Buddhism, and he developed the system that he calls philosophical midwifery. The name, by the way, comes from Plato's dialogue Theaetetus, because in that video, Plato compared himself to a midwife. He said that his own mother was a midwife, and he carries on that family tradition. Only he says that instead of delivering babies, he helps people deliver insights. And so this system, it really is actually the founding of the whole philosophical counseling movement. Dr. Grimes first published back in the 1950s. He's in his 90s now. He's still quite active. He's been doing this for like 70 years. But this was really the beginning of the whole philosophical counseling movement. And his book, Philosophical Midwifery, I think is out of print. You may be able to find a used copy. But he does have a book now that he calls Unblocking. It's a workbook for people working on their own. And so you may find it helpful. I'll put a link for it below in the description box for those of you who are interested. What I'm going to be giving you is my adaptation, working by myself. Because his system, ideally, you're working with a midwife who's asking you questions. But if you're working on your own, then obviously you have to adapt his methods. And so that's what I'm going to give you since we're all working on our own. His workbook, by the way, may be helpful in getting more specific questions. The basic premise of all of this is something that I think we're all quite familiar with. Whenever we are seeking a personally meaningful goal that goes beyond our current limitations, we're going to be confronting our current self-image. And our current image is always going to be something a bit limiting because we're trying to push beyond that. And so there's naturally going to be some friction. I'm going to age myself for a minute here. I'll tell you the story that when I was in grade school, there were often these made-for-TV movies that were made for kids my age, where like the main character is like a high school kid who wants to, I don't know, win the spelling bee or win the big sporting event or get the guy or get the girl, whatever. But, oh, mama left when I was 4 years old and I've always felt inadequate and not good enough. And so, we kind of make fun of these kind of stories, but it is a common storyline. We recognize that there is some truth to that. And what makes it corny, though, these kind of movies, is that it's always something really big, major in that person's life, something easy to point to and say, that's the problem. Mama left when you were 4 years old, or maybe one of your parents was emotionally abusive or neglectful, or had a alcohol problem or drug problem or something. So it's something very big that you can look at and say that is what's causing the problem. And while, yes, of course, those sorts of things, they are significant, what we're going to find is that the kinds of things that we're looking for, the kinds of blocks that we're going to find ourselves hitting up against, the kinds of limiting self-images, their root is something far more subtle. Even people who do have those sorts of traumas in their life are going to find that they're eventually going to have to come to this more subtle layer of issues. And so whether you've had a traumatic childhood or not, you do have limiting self-images. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. Okay, so first I want to give you some of the terminology that Dr. Grimes uses because I'm going to use it as well, and it'll just make sure we're on the same page. It'll make the explanation easier. So the first one thing we want to look at is a block, and this is really what I focused on in that earlier introductory video. The block is whenever you are, say you're studying or you are trying to meditate and you find that it's really hard to go forward. Maybe you're just suddenly getting a burst of anger and you don't even know why. Or maybe you feel very bored or suddenly tired or you have a headache. These are the blocks. They stop us from going forward. And what we're going to find that these blocks are pointing to is a limiting self-belief. Dr. Grimes calls these pathologos. He coined this word because the etymology of it means a sick belief. It's a belief that we hold in our soul that is unhealthy and keeps us from knowing the true self. So what we're focusing on is a particular type of false belief, one that he calls the pathologos. Now, first we're going to look at our milieu, and this I think just comes from psychiatry. I think we all are familiar with this word. I talked about this some on that earlier video because it's much easier to remember in kind of in a general way. This is what my family was like. Maybe your parents are very outgoing and loud. Maybe they're very quiet and you had a very quiet home. Or maybe your parents are very strict. Maybe they're lenient. All kinds of parenting styles. Whatever your home life was, that's just kind of like the way things are, what seems your sense of normal and your family's sense of normal. So that's the milieu. And so initially, maybe we look at that. It's very easy to see. But eventually what we want to do is try to remember specific events from our past. And eventually we're going to go back to that first time that we drew a certain conclusion about ourselves that gave us a pathologos belief, a limiting self-image. Dr. Grimes calls that a transmission scene. I think he may have gotten this name from his background in Zen Buddhism. He is actually a Zen Roshi. And in the Zen tradition, they talk about the transmission of the Dharma, the teachings. Well, our families have teachings that are passed from generation to generation. And so one thing I want to stress right up front is that this is not a blame game. The example I'm going to use, I'll take one example from my life as I go through the video, and I'm going to talk about a pathologos that I walked away with after an interaction with my mother. Now, the point is not, though, to blame my mother. She's a good mother. She's a loving mother. I have no problems with my mom. This is a family belief. It's one that she holds herself, and my grandfather had it as well. I never knew my grandmother, but I know that my grandfather had the same belief, and had I not done this work, I very likely would have passed the same belief on to my kids. So it's not about being a bad person. It's not about a blame game. It's about recognizing a family belief that is transmitted from generation to generation. Also, at the end of the video, I'm going to give you a little bonus. I'm going to talk about something called a counterattack. Okay, first though, let's take a look at 5 steps to identify a block and a transmission scene. We're going to see lots of groups of 5, by the way, throughout this video. Everything is a group of 5. So these are the techniques that I use to identify the block as it's coming up, and also how to use that to kind of trace back through my life to find the time when I first started feeling this way. Okay, so the first thing you want to do, say you're reading and you decide you've hit a block, it's just really hard to go forward, you can't just push your way through, you think you need to stop and look at this. And so either you just stop what you're doing, or maybe you set some time aside because you know you keep having this issue and you want to look at it. Whatever the timing is, when you are ready to look at your block, you want to be in a relaxed, meditative state. So whatever it is that you do to get into that state of mind, that's what you want to do. Maybe take some deep breaths, do a little meditation, do some breathing exercises, listen to some meditation music. Whatever it is that you do to get into that quiet, introspective place, that's what you want to do, because that's the state of mind we want to be in. And then what you want to do is identify the manifestation of the block. And there are a few things we're going to look at. I talked about this on that previous video, but I'll just quickly run through some of it now. So first you want to think about the physical sensations. The block generally has a physical feeling to go along with the psychological. Maybe you feel a tightness in your chest, or maybe you get a sudden sharp headache, or pain in your shoulders, or maybe your stomach feels like it's turning, whatever the physical sensation is, make note of that. It's good to keep a journal and actually just write this all down. Think about the physical sensations. Also, what are the emotions? Is it a burst of anger? Do you suddenly feel very scared and you don't even know why you're scared? Do you suddenly feel very tired or get headaches and suddenly just want to sleep or do something else? So think about how it actually feels emotionally as well as how it feels physically. Put as many words on it as you can. And along with words, also think about actual words that pop in your head, actual thoughts that come to you. In fact, if you can write an actual quote of a sentence that keeps coming, a phrase that's coming. Maybe you imagine somebody in your past telling you, "Oh, this is a waste of time. Do something practical. You can't make money doing this." Or maybe you hear somebody saying, "This is arrogant. You're not going to wake up. What does that mean to be enlightened? Oh, you think you're better than the rest of us?" So there are all the kinds of thoughts that come to us. Are you being arrogant? So write down whatever the phrasing is. Together, what you have here, the physical sensations, the emotions, the thoughts, this gives you the state of mind that you fall into when your pathologos is triggered. And so once you've identified that, then the next thing to do is to identify the trigger. What were you doing when this block manifested? What were you doing just before this state of mind hit you? Now, it may be something general, like every time you sit down to meditate, this happens, or every time you sit down to study philosophy and you open your book and you sit down to read, this hits you. It also might happen that it was because of a particular thought that popped in your head when you were meditating, or maybe you read a certain sentence and a certain idea triggered a block. So you want to try to get as specific as you can and identify what exactly is that trigger. Now, steps 4 and 5 are we're taking that state of mind and we want to connect it to the past, because it's very likely, actually more than likely, it's something that must be familiar to you. You know this state of mind, these physical sensations, these emotions, these thoughts. The situation may be something new, but the state of mind is one that has been repeating throughout your life. And so we want to connect that state of mind to our past. Now, initially, we're going to probably be focusing on the milieu. And again, this is something that I talked about in that earlier video of thinking about your family's culture, your family's way, and how does that fit the certain block that you're dealing with. But then eventually you want to try to go through your past and think about specific events. Probably you're going to pick out some recent events first, and then you're going to, as you go back, you may go, some people can actually immediately go back to a very early scene, maybe when you're a toddler up to maybe 8 years old is when you're going to find these transmission scenes. Sometimes it does happen that a scene just pops out, or it's one that we've thought about many times, but we never knew quite how to analyze it or what to do with it. It often happens, though, that we can only go back as far as maybe middle school or maybe even only high school. And that's fine. If that's all you come up with, if that's the best that you can come up with, then just work with that. And hopefully another earlier scene will open up for you. So the later scenes, you've already picked up a certain belief and now you're acting on it. And so it's a little different than a transmission scene. But you can still see a lot by working with it, so it's better than nothing. Okay, with that in mind, now it is difficult to uncover these memories, so I'm going to give you some techniques, and again, there are 5 of them. One of them is to focus on bodily sensations. So our bodies have a certain intelligence. It's like riding a bicycle, you never forget. So we can tap into that bodily intelligence. We should use it. So focus on that feeling, whatever it was that you had written down as the physical sensations of the block. Focus on those in your body as you're turning inward, and really just kind of meditate on those feelings and ask yourself what memories are locked into that tension or that flutter in your chest or whatever the bodily sensation is. What memory is there? Another one is to focus on that inner dialogue. Ask yourself who used to say this, or do you see the person saying it? When did they say this to you? What kind of situations? Follow that inner dialogue. Also, our daydreams are really key. One thing I'll warn you about up front is that philosophical midwifery really does take the sacredness out of our daydreams. So I warn you of that up front. But what we'll find if we want to analyze our daydreams is that in the very first instant of our daydream, the very first second or fraction of a second, there is an image right there, a full blown self image. And that is at the root of the whole daydream. Now, let me give you an example. Say, for example, a person feels small and insignificant. Now, there are two basic ways a daydream might unfold. It might be kind of like dystopic, a dystopic type of daydream where it's like the worst case scenario of people treating you like you don't matter and you're very small and insignificant. And it may be you acting out all of the worst experiences of your life or the worst images you have of that, maybe even taken to an extreme beyond anything you've actually experienced. That can happen in a daydream. Another way is to flip it, to try to escape those ugly feelings by saying instead, well, you feel small, so in the daydream you're larger than life. You are the hero of the day, the one who solves all the problems, the one who's the most important in the scene, maybe a superhero. Either way that your daydreams might go, there is that same self-image at the root. And what we'll find is that we may have certain themes of daydreams that kind of carry with us over time. When a certain pathologos is surfacing, the images attached to it are going to show up in our daydreams at that time. Certain daydreams show up now and other daydreams at other times in our life. The ones that are showing up now are the ones that are surfacing. And so looking at our daydreams is another way to uncover what that block is and to give you some of those breadcrumbs that are going to lead you back to a memory. Added to all of this, doing both steps 1 and 2 also is just sitting in silence. Now, there are lots of theories about where our memories are, and different people watching this video have different ideas about this. Some of you might think that these memories are in the soul, and we carry it with us even over many lifetimes. Others may think, no, there's a place in the brain where we store our memories. Whatever your current beliefs are, it's irrelevant to this video. Outside the scope of what we're talking about today, but wherever you think they are, what you're going to find is that sitting in silence will help to surface those memories. I like to think of it as kind of like letting your thoughts incubate and they come to birth in time. So sitting in silence is really powerful. I find it helpful to move energy while I'm doing this. Think of like in yoga, focusing on around the navel center is a very powerful energy center. Imagine energy going in through the navel and going up and out the top of the head. Even Plato in his in a few of his dialogues, in the Theaetetus, for example, in the Timaeus, he says that the daimon is at the top of our head. And so imagining energy going up and out the top of the head, often will close my eyes and turn my eyes upward as though I could see the top of my head, moving energy upward. And that does help to raise the energy, and it can be very helpful in trying to uncover memories. Also, throughout all of this, notice which family members pop into your thoughts. And this can also extend to even maybe some of the kids you were close to when you were very young. Sometimes instead of a full memory popping out with all the details in place, maybe we just hear some of that inner dialogue, or maybe we just see a certain family member, see their body language or their facial expressions. Sometimes maybe I can't quite hear what the person's saying, but I can kind of hear the tone of voice. All of these things are clues. And they're probably pieces of the memory you're trying to uncover. And so keeping track of all of this is very helpful. And then just kind of wrap this all up, all these 5 work together, is keeping a list. very likely you're not going to do this all in one sitting. Hopefully you'll see enough in one sitting to be able to at least get back on track and get back to your work. But we do ultimately want to know ourselves, to understand ourselves, to get past these limiting self-images. You may get past it today, but it's going to keep coming back until you understand it better. So we're going to keep coming back to these. Ideally, you want to do this more than once. And so you're not going to collect all this information all in one day. And so keeping a list is very helpful, to actually write it all down so you don't have to hold it in your memory. Think about the bodily sensations, the inner dialogue, the emotions, which family members pop in your head, all of this stuff. Keep a list of all of it and just keep adding to it each time you do a sitting. Okay, that said, say you pull out a memory finally. Hopefully it's a transmission scene, but even if it's a later scene, we can still work with it. And now I'm going to give you 5 steps to analyze a transmission scene. Now I'm going to give you an example from my own experience because I think it will help us understand what these steps are. So I'll tell you what the block was. The block hit me when I was reading Proclus's Theology of Plato. It's a very difficult text. Now when I first opened it up, when I was fairly new to Platonism, I got some very good advice. I was told, don't worry about understanding everything he wrote. It is just too difficult, and there's too much background information you need. You need to understand the metaphysics to some degree, at least have some sense of the basic outline of it, the basic framework of it, in order to really understand what he's talking about. So I was told, don't worry about understanding everything. Just take lots of notes, try to get that basic structure, make lots of diagrams, and whatever I don't understand, put it aside and come back to the book at a later date. This actually allowed me to get past my block to some degree, and I actually did get through the book. I wouldn't say with ease, but I could get through the whole book that first time through. I would hit these blocks, though, where I would get very frustrated and feel like this is too difficult for me. Maybe I'm just not cut out to do philosophy. It was very frustrating. But because of that advice, I was able to somewhat bypass this particular block. However, a few years passed. I continued reading Plato and studying with Dr. Grimes and learning this framework, and I did have some basic sense of it. A few years in, we're talking maybe, 5 or 6 years into my studies, I decided to go back to Theology of Plato, feeling like now I'm going to master it. I'm going to get it all. Well, it was very difficult, and I found it wasn't so easy to master, and I found myself hitting against this block where I felt overwhelmed. I was in over my head. I thought, I'm just not cut out for philosophy. But I didn't want to quit. I felt this is something too meaningful to quit. I quit many things in my childhood. I tried ballet and tap. I've tried different instruments. I tried sports. And I always felt like I'm just not cut out for this. But philosophy was different. I wanted to master this. I wanted to understand it. I shouldn't say master it, but at least understand it, understand myself. And so I wasn't willing to quit. And that meant I had a block. And so I used these techniques, and I eventually came to a scene from my childhood. I was 7 years old. This was a ballet recital. And my mom came to watch me, and I'll say my mom is not one who really enjoyed school events like this. She's kind of a Homer Simpson-ish when it comes to watching recitals and school plays and that sort of thing. Her response to the dancing is she was kind of like making fun of how all the kids were doing something different. She laughed and said all the kids were doing something different. Nobody really knew the dance well. Okay, we were 7 years old. But to her, maybe it was just a joke. It was just fun. This was her reaction to it. That's what she saw. We probably were really everyone doing something different. To her, it was, she's not one to think very deeply or to think about, the deeper effects of what she's saying. She just blurts out whatever she's thinking. But as a 7-year-old, I was crushed, and I walked away thinking, I'm not cut out to do ballet. All right, so on the surface, we can see some parallels to the language. I'm not cut out to do philosophy, I'm not cut out to do ballet. But we still have to ask ourselves, why would something like that, so mundane, from 7 years old, have an effect that would reverberate through my life such that 20 plus years later, when I'm reading Proclus, I have that same kind of thought? So let's take a look at how to analyze a transmission scene. So first thing you want to do is you pinpoint the memory and you want to write it out. It has stages to it. And the more clearly you can see those stages, the better. And as much detail as you can give also, the better. So it may be helpful to actually unfold it in scenes and give as much detail as you can about the people involved, their body language, their tone of voice, people's states of mind at each step along the way. You might even number the stages just to help you really see the flow of it all. Now, the next step is a long one, and we have another group of 5 here. Dr. Grimes pinpointed 5 conditions that must exist for a transmission scene. And taking your memory and putting it up against these 5 is very helpful in better understanding the significance of what happened. If what you are looking at is actually not a transmission scene, maybe it won't fit all 5, but you will see why it's not a transmission scene. And it may even help jog your thoughts, and you might remember something even earlier where you picked up the belief that you're acting on in that later scene. Okay, let's take a look at the 5 conditions, and I'll talk about them in terms of my experience when I was 7 years old. So the first one is that we're young and we're open-minded. Now, being open-minded is a very healthy state of mind. And what we're going to see is that the transmission of the Dharma in a wisdom tradition and the transmission of a false belief in these pathologos scenes have a lot of parallels. The transmission of the pathologos is just a distortion, really, of a healthy teaching. And so we're in this healthy state of mind that we want to be in when we are studying philosophy or any kind of wisdom tradition. Unfortunately, because our teachers are not yogis or Zen masters, some of the teachings that we learn as children are not healthy ones. But we're in that open state of mind. And we can see when I was 7 years old, I was in that open state because I had just danced in this recital, and I was looking to my mom for a reaction and for some hopefully positive feedback, which I didn't get. Okay, we're the object of the lesson. I was her focus. She was very animated, and we're going to find that oftentimes the parent it's not always a parent, it may be guardian and whoever was raising us or who was a big influence on our life as when we were children, in this case a parent. The person is really showing themselves in a more animated way, kind of coming out of the norm. And that's one of the reasons that it really stands out. We are the object, the complete focus of that lesson, or at least it feels that way to us, because we're often, like in this case, I was quite nervous. There were other people around, but I felt like it was all eyes were on me. And so I was the object of the lesson. I was the one she was talking about. I was the one who just performed in this ballet recital that she was commenting on. The third one is that we see, in this case, the parent as a knower. Now, I put knower in quotes because the person is obviously not a knower in the true sense. But we see our parents as knowers. We don't question their knowledge or their wisdom when we're so young. And we feel that this person knows us well. If a total stranger had said this to me, it wouldn't have had the same effect. I probably wouldn't even remember it. Now, in that hypothetical case of someone else saying it, the way my mother reacted to it, that would have an effect on me. And that might be what sticks with me. But I feel that she knows me, that she's a knower and she knows me well. Also very closely connected to that is I feel that she is working for my benefit. This is always the case in a transmission scene. Even if it's a case where a parent is punishing you or you think it's unfair, still on some level you feel like this person is working for your benefit, and that will cause us to twist things in such a way that we'll try to save them, and that will add to our conclusion. Even when the parent is being unfair, we'll try to kind of save them So they're always acting for our benefit. And the fifth one is that whatever conclusion we come to, it's one that we drew ourselves. It's not one that we were told. It's our own conclusion based on our own way of thinking and what we're taking in of what happened and this assumption that the person knows us and is working for our benefit. So we draw our own conclusion, and that's part of what gives it its power, is that we believe it. It's very convincing because we drew that conclusion ourselves. Okay, so all of this is only the second step. So we've written it down, we've looked at these 5 conditions. The third step is to recognize that within all of this is an image of the way things are. Now, as adults, we can look back and see this is just the way my family functioned. But as a child, that's all you know. And so it's your idea of the way things are. So like in my case here, my mother said, all the kids were doing something different. She laughed at us. I don't think she meant it to be mean. It was just funny to her. But it felt to me like, oh, this is just the way it is. I'm not a good dancer. And in my family, this also fits the milieu very well. This is where the milieu and the transmission scene really do come together. And it can also often be that key. The step number 3 is often for me the key to seeing why I drew the conclusion I drew. Because in my family, you either know something or you don't. My mom was always very encouraging of those things I was naturally good at. Like I was good at writing stories. I liked making up stories. And she was always very encouraging of that. But, I was no prima ballerina or no Mozart when I tried to play violin. Or I have a brother who was no Babe Ruth, and so he quit Little League. But he's a very good artist, and she was always very supportive of his art. I have another brother who's very good at math, and just a natural genius at it, and she was always very supportive of that. And I see it in her own behavior as well, that there are things she's good at and things she doesn't bother with. And same, I saw that with my grandfather as well. So this is the family belief. You either know it or you don't. You're either good at it or you're not. You have some talents and other things you don't have talent in. And that's just the way things are. And so that's the family belief. And so that's the conclusion that I reached. Now, the compromise is often when you're trying to save your parents and try to, like I may have believed that I could dance. I maybe have enjoyed it. I don't remember actually, but there's a certain compromise if this is the way things are. Mom said I'm not a good dancer, so I'm not. And so I made a certain compromise. I reached a conclusion. And so we want to identify what is that conclusion that we reached based on those 5 conditions of a transmission scene, and recognizing that for the family, this is the way things are. Now, once you see this, you can answer to your parents. And one common technique is to actually try to imagine going back in time, seeing yourself again, like in this case, as a 7-year-old at that ballet recital. How would I answer my mom when she says everyone is doing something different? I could respond by saying, well, at least I was the one doing it right. Too bad the other kids weren't following me. Or maybe I can respond by saying, well, hey, I'm only 7 years old. I'll do better when I'm 8. Wait till you see me dancing when I'm 10. So now I can see that, of course, you can study something, you can learn, you can grow. Even like when I brought home a bad grade from school, a B minus or a C, my mom never said, hey, let's study more, or you'll do better in the future, let's get you a tutor. It was never anything like that. What I heard was, you're a smart girl, you can do better. As if I was just being lazy or I just didn't try enough. Because you either know it or you don't. That's the family belief. And it's a limiting one. It's limited my mother. It's limited my grandfather. It's limited other people in my family. It's the family belief. And if I had just carried it on, I would probably teach it to my kids as well. Because it's something that you just kind of accept as a given. It's one of the assumptions of your life that you don't question, no matter how well-intentioned you are as a parent. Now, going back then to Proclus, now I want to go back and read the book knowing that, okay, I can do this. It's wrong to think I cannot do it because it's difficult. And so I need to struggle through it. Now, what I'm going to find when I go back is that this way of thinking, even though this old way, even though I now see through it, it's my habit. And so it's not going to just immediately dissipate. these thoughts are going to come back. These voices in my head are going to come back. This knee-jerk reaction to thinking this is too hard, I'm in over my head. That thought is still going to be there, and I need to recognize that. And that brings us to the bonus of looking out for the counterattacks. What Dr. Grimes calls that knee-jerk reaction to get pulled back in is the counterattack. It's very easy to get pulled back in if you don't recognize to look out for this. It's a phenomenon that always happens. And so you need to be on the lookout for it. And when it happens, if you can recognize it, you can see it for what it is without giving it power, without giving it validity. Just take a deep breath and say, no, this is wrong. I'm going to muddle through this. I'm going to push along, and I'm going to understand as much as I can. And if I don't master this book the second time through, maybe I'll get it the third, and I'll get a little more the third, and I'll get a little more the fourth, and I'll just keep doing it until I've mastered this book. Or whatever the task is you're doing, you'll master it little by little. You don't have to know it all at once. You don't need perfection. It's not true that you either know it or you don't. It has to come easy, or you're in over your head and you should just quit. That is wrong. If you recognize it, like in this case, I'm just using this as an example, of course, whatever your belief is, if you recognize the falsehood of it, then when those voices come, when that knee-jerk reaction comes to say, mom was right all along, you can recognize it for what it is and push it aside. Now, what you'll find is that all of this has the practical side of helping you immediately get back on track and push along and keep going in your practice. But over the long run, this really does have a very positive benefit to our lives. I can tell you from my own experience that I'm in a much happier, more stable place now than I was when I first met Dr. Grimes 20 plus years ago. I used to have a lot of insecurities. I had a lot of self-doubts. I had bouts of depression. I often felt lonely. I don't feel those ways anymore, and it's because I did this work. Now, conventional wisdom says that now I'm happily married and I have 2 happy kids, and that's why I don't have bouts of depression and I'm not lonely anymore. However, I think that we all know that it's actually the other way around. I think anyone watching this video probably is the introspective type of person, and so I think we all recognize that we have to be healthy on the inside in order to manifest a healthy life on the outside in the external world. And so it's the other way around. It's not that I have a happy life and therefore I'm in a stable, happy place. It's rather that I worked through these issues that had me falling into depression and feelings of loneliness. I'm in a healthier, more stable place emotionally, and that's why I'm able to have a happy marriage and a happy family. And so there's my little testimonial for you. I can tell you from my own experience that these practices over the long run really are helpful in understanding ourselves as human beings. In our study of philosophy, of course, we want to know the self in that higher metaphysical sense. That's ultimately the goal. But we also have to live in the world, and we have to understand ourselves as human beings. We need to get past and overcome our limiting self-images on that path to understanding the self, to know thyself. And we also want to be able to live a happy, stable life that is, we can do the things we want to do in this world in an effective way. And so these techniques are also part of that philosophical journey. We're coming to health in 2 different directions. We're looking at what is truth about the self, and also we have to clear away what is false about the self. And doing this 2-pronged, let's say double-pronged approach to understanding ourselves is the way to become healthy. So I do recommend that you give these techniques a try. There's still quite a bit more I can say about this. If you are interested in this sort of material, then please let me know and I'll make more videos about this. And As always, if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please hit the like button. I'd really appreciate that. And I hope that you'll subscribe if you don't already. If you hit that little bell icon below, then you will get notifications whenever I have a new video out. So next week I am going to go back to Proclus. I'm not afraid of him anymore. And we're going to look at his elements of theology once again. So I do hope you'll join me for that. Thank you very much.